Hi, I'm Maddie,
And I'm Abigail, and this is
two writers.
Many Wrongs. Two writers, many, many projects. Or maybe two writers trying to finish a draft. Uh, Maybe we could do two writers frustratingly trying to just get through these edits. I don't know. Take your pick.
Two writers. When's that novel coming out?
Oh, when is that novel coming out is a great question. Today, we're talking about our projects that we're working on and specifically what is most frustrating about them.
Everything.
Yeah, not everything though. There are bright spots. Like that
Are there?
feeling, to me personally, that feeling when you finally send it out to beta readers is such a relief because it's like out of my hands. But then you get all the notes from the beta readers back and you're like, fuck, I have a lot to work on.
Yeah,
Yeah. So let's start just by talking about what projects we're doing right now. So what are you working on?
I'm working on a novel.
Hmm.
Space opera is how I would probably categorize it. How,
Love that.
how you know, how I think an agent, should I ever be able to talk to one, would categorize it.
Hmm.
And I've been working on this for like a decade.
Hmm. Yeah. The
Mm,
the novels take a long time. I have two different novels and two different like stages right now. The first novel I actually wrote the summer after I graduated from undergrad. So like 2015, 2016 in there.
mhm.
Um, and then the second novel I started writing after I sent the first one out to beta readers, and that one like flew by, really didn't take nearly as much time. I'd kind of work those muscles through grad school and all that kind of stuff. Um, but both of them have been through the beta reader process, and now I just have a bunch of edits I'm trying to get through. And then, of course, there's always the smattering of short stories, which I know you have as well, and you have
Yes.
your poetry.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm also in the process. I have a finished poetry collection
Hmm.
that I'm trying to submit around. That's a little bit of a different process though, because you typically don't need an agent for poetry collections. So right now I'm trying contests, but I think after it comes back from this batch of contests, I'm gonna try just getting it traditionally published, like through a publisher.
Nice.
Um,
We have a couple of friends who have poetry collections published from grad school, so that's really awesome.
yeah, that'll be cool if that happens, and
Hmm.
gives me something to focus on while I sit and wallow in existential dread because of this novel.
Yeah.
That I actually, so I wrote it, I finished it, and then I realized that I didn't really know what to do next once I
Hmm.
finished the novel. So that's when I went to grad school. So I put the novel on hiatus because my novel's very convoluted. It has a lot of lore involved in it, and it's like there's going to be multiple books, and I just felt like it was too complicated to like do in like a workshop because I didn't feel like you could take a chapter out of it and be
Hmm.
able to accurately. So anyway, so I focused on short stories that were kind of in a similar vein. So I wrote a short story
Hmm.
collection, and then I took a 2-year hiatus from writing. So that was like 4 years. I wrote it, and then I took a 4-year break from working on it.
Hmm. I think that's a really common story too, because I wrote the first draft of my novel and then put it in a drawer, as we all do. And I left it for a year, um, maybe a year and a half, something like that. I didn't start working on it again until my third term at grad school. And I really wanted to spend the first and second term of grad school working on short stories, kind of rehoning my craft because I had been out of school for a year at that point and just like trying to work, trying to whatever. So I really wanted to refocus on just like the basic building blocks before trying to get into editing my own novel. So I also took time off there. And then after grad school, kind of tried to go through the process of doing all the edits that I wanted to do. But, I think that's one of the things that is so common for writers that is frustrating is we are pretty consistently told like it's a hobby, you know. You fit it in when you can. And of course, you know, we've talked about this before. A lot of published authors will say, like, oh, you're only a writer if you write every single day. Like, you have to make it a priority, blah, 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 blah. Which is true. You do have to make it a priority. But asking somebody who also has to pay their own rent and cook their own groceries or cook, you know, cook their own meals and take care of their own house and all of that stuff. It's hard to cut out time every single day to write.
Yes.
And, you know, again, successful authors often, you know, that is their job, is writing. So it's great that, you know, Stephen King can spend 9 to 5 doing that. I have 3 jobs that I am trying to navigate while also working on my edits and working on my drafts. So, you know, this novel, even having gone through the beta readers and stuff, it's like you said, it's been a decade of trying to get through this.
Yeah. I think too, it's not like a decade of solid work.
Hmm.
Like there were gaps where I didn't work on it there because I went in the timeline. I was working a full-time job
Hmm.
when I wrote this novel, and I had like a 2-hour commute like in total. So and then I was the one who did the cooking at home,
Hmm.
and I had other responsibilities, and so I didn't have time to like carve out dedicated. And because of those gaps, there'd be like a period of like, where was I? What was I doing?
Yes.
And you'd have to kind of restart, not
Hmm.
necessarily over, but you'd have to like kind of go back a bit to like kind of
Hmm.
get yourself in the mindset again of the stuff
Hmm.
that you were writing. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, and I'm a big believer when it comes to edits of just continuing to move forward. I know that a lot of people, and you've talked about this some, get stuck with like, I have to have the perfect opening before I can move forward. And I know that I will get myself stuck in a loop if I try and do that. So
yeah,
I have to just keep moving forward. The downside of that though is then I end up going through the draft 6, 7 times because of continuity shifts. Because I'll be writing it, you know, have a really solid, you know, 6 months of being able to write once or twice a week, and then have to take time off, whether that's another 6 months or, you know, whatever, and then coming back to it and being like, oh yeah, I have this really great idea I'm going to implement. I have to go all the way back to the beginning and make sure that that continuity makes sense. And even though, you know, I take a lot of notes, you take a copious amount of notes, especially when working in sci-fi, you have to.
yeah.
You know, I'll take notes, but then I'll be like, what kind of car does my main character drive? Like, I know I mentioned it before. And then you have to go back through the draft and find that little tiny thing. So all of these little frustrations, um, you know, that come with our different projects, can delay the process of trying to get it in a good enough place to query agents.
Yeah, and I think too, with science fiction, I'll make up
Mm-hmm.
stuff. Like, they don't have cell phones. They have
Mm-hmm.
something else. And so I'll be reading through a draft and I'll call it something. And then like a couple chapters later, I'll call it something else, or it works completely differently. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
I need to decide what these look like. And then that
Mm-hmm.
can kind of distract a little bit. But usually I try not to like worry so much about those details.
Mm-hmm.
I just try to focus on the bigger story as I move
Mm-hmm.
forward. Um, but yeah, it's really difficult when you get so hung up on the continuity, which is so hard to
Mm-hmm.
mess up, especially when you're taking like when you're writing maybe once or twice a week. And then,
Exactly.
you there's so much that you can miss and you can forget
Mm-hmm.
that happened in the previous chapter. Sometimes I'll have to go back because I'm also dealing with multiple perspectives. There's 5 or 6 different perspectives in my novel. So then I'm like, did I already reveal that piece of information?
Oh,
It's too
yeah.
soon to reveal it. What was
Mm-hmm.
that character is going to be in this scene, but does it make sense that he's in this scene? What was he
Mm-hmm.
doing in the previous perspective that you'll be like, wait, he's over here. Why would he be over here now? So like having to keep track. I actually
Mm-hmm.
did separate timelines um for like so I would like put where everybody was
Mm-hmm.
in
Oh,
that
I've seen
timeline.
the spreadsheet. It's impressive.
So many spreadsheets.
Yeah. Yeah. I that is something that I'm dreading with finally editing my second book because my second book is, I think, six different perspectives and it's not told linearly. So the continuity for that is going to be a bitch when I finally get to it. But what two questions. Number one, what draft version are you on? And two, how do you categorize your drafts?
So I used to count the drafts,
Mm-hmm.
but I started over when I re revisited it after grad school.
Mm-hmm.
So, I wrote a draft, took a hiatus when I went to grad school. Grad school wrecked me, so took like a year or two off.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I finally went back to it, I was mostly some of the stuff is the same, but a lot
Mm-hmm.
of stuff I had to rewrite and rework because I was kind of doing a completely different, not
Mm-hmm.
same vibes, but the story was a little bit more concrete.
Yeah.
So that was when I started counting again. So there were a bunch of drafts before this, but
Mm-hmm.
I count this draft that I'm working on now is draft number two because when I started rewriting it in 2021,
Mm-hmm.
I finished in 2022, and that was like the
Mm-hmm.
rewrite, like the solid draft. I call that
Yep.
draft one. It's
Yeah.
the final full draft of it, not final, but the full
Yeah,
draft of
yeah.
it. And
Mm-hmm.
now I'm doing edits, and I haven't stopped
Mm-hmm.
doing edits on it. So I'm considering once I finish this, that'll be draft two.
Nice. Yeah. I am on draft four of my novel right now, and I only count it as a new draft if I am making dramatic changes to the plot, basically.
Mhm.
So I individually, I'm looking at my folders here. I have 1 and 1.2, 2 and 2.2, 3 goes all the way up to 3.3. And then I'm working on draft four right now. And the subsets of each draft is like if I'm changing, like minor things or changing like grammar kind of stuff. Um, so I keep anytime that I go and do like a revision all the way through the
Yeah.
draft, I mark it as a new thing. But if I'm making major changes, is when it's a brand new draft version. So I probably have whatever 8 different versions of this, but only four that I consider like four full revised drafts.
Mm.
Um, and the hardest part is uh for me personally, like when I make those big revision changes, so like in grad school, I love John Hughes and I really wanted this to be set in like a John Hughes, like, middle of nowhere kind of Midwestern, like small town kind of deal.
Mhm.
And I got to grad school and my teacher goes, "You've never been out of Florida, have you?" And I'm like, "Yes, I have." He goes, "You've never lived out of Florida, have you?" And I was like, "No, why?" And he's like, "Yeah, because the story doesn't make sense. Like, I can tell that this is just a made-up fictionalized town." He's like, "You should set it in Florida. Like, you know Florida, you have a deep connection to Florida. Like, you need to reset your story."
Yeah.
So I had to go through the entire draft and reset everything. Um, and I'm still getting through the continuity of that where I'm like, there was a slight, chill in the air. And it's like, nope, it's September in Florida. There's not a slight chill in the air. Um, so like it's such a bitch finding those major continuity errors. And that's what I'm doing right now with my fourth draft is I completely changed the plot of one of my main characters and what she's going through. So as I'm doing these edits, there are huge swaths of, you know, scenes that I have to completely rewrite because
Yeah.
she is doing something different now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's okay. That's really interesting about like what was it about your story that was so like this is you've never lived out a Florida girl.
I don't know. It was Stefan who said it too. He was my harshest, but also my favorite mentors, to be fair. I like somebody who just is very straightforward.
Sure.
You know. So when he said that to me, I was like, I can't even argue with you because you're right. I don't know what it's like to have a winter in the Midwest. I don't know, what it's like to have to shovel snow or any of that. So I thought that it would be easier to have it in this make-believe town. And the funny thing is, I actually moved it and set it in Jacksonville before I lived in
Okay.
Jacksonville. So then when I lived there for 2 years, I basically used the whole time to like gather information to put into the novel to make it, more accurate.
Huh.
Yeah, I know.
Were there things like that you'd written about living in Jacksonville that once you lived in Jacksonville, you're like, I didn't even
Yes.
know.
Oh my God, yes. Yeah, there were several things where I was like, that's not in Jacksonville, it's not a real thing. So the funniest thing is like I want to put in just enough detail so that people in Jacksonville are like, "Oh my God, like that's really here." But you don't want to make it so accurate that people who don't live in Jacksonville are like, "I don't give a shit about what road we're on," you know?
Right, right, right.
Um, so, I think I tend to get bogged down in like the reality of shit. And at some point you just have to let go of that reality and write the story. So there's definitely stuff that people in Jacksonville are going to read and be like, well, that's not quite how that works. But I'm hoping there's enough in there to, keep it reliable.
Yeah,
Um, but I think that's one of the most frustrating things about this project currently is, it's completely, not completely, but it is drastically different from the very, very first draft, as far as like where the characters are, their personalities, and every single draft, I'm rewriting all of this, trying to, uh, make it make sense. So,
yeah.
what's the most
But
frustrating part of your project that you're working on?
well, before we move on, I do want to point
Yeah.
out because it's so interesting to me talking about like
Hmm.
writing about a real place. I
Yeah.
recently read Babel. I don't know if you've
Hmm.
read that by
I
R.S.
haven't, but people at the store love it.
Oh, it's phenomenal. She's an amazing, incredible
Hmm.
writer. But she's talking about you know, Oxford, which is
Oh.
it takes place
Hmm.
at Oxford and it's a
Hmm.
very well-known place. And
Yep.
so she has an introduction in which she explains that like, hey, I know there may be some things you don't um
Hmm.
recognized for Oxford, and she like kind of explained things she changed and that she changed them for the story reasons, and she's like, look,
Hmm.
I know that restaurant isn't there, it's actually over there, but it didn't make
Right.
sense in the story. And
Hmm.
then kind of like she's like, I know if it's not the Oxford you remember, I do apologize. And she's like, but
Hmm.
and she's like, if at any point in time you get mad about things not Oxford
Hmm.
not being the way you remember it, please feel free to remind yourself this is a work of fiction.
Amazing.
And I was like,
I
snaps for that.
Well, and I love that she included it. I also think it's funny that she felt the necessity to include it because Oxford is one of those places that people feel so strongly
Strongly.
about.
Especially this, she's an American.
Right. And so I'm kind of hoping that like I mean Jacksonville definitely like cares about Jacksonville, but I also, I lived in Jacksonville for 2 years. I'm not anticipating my biggest reader swath to be from Jacksonville. So I might have some complaints here and there, but I'm also, I don't think that it's going to be one of those things where even people who visit Oxford feel so strongly about it.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm going to have people who live in Florida reading the book being like, oh, that is the name of that road. Okay, cool. And the stuff that doesn't make sense, hopefully they'll just be like, whatever. What's most frustrating about your current project?
So when I first wrote this book,
Hmm.
um, I had a lot going on in it, and I ended up breaking it into like three parts. Um, that I now think they should be three whole books. Like there's just
Oh
too
God.
much for me to do.
Hmm.
So the book that I'm working on now is actually the first third of the original book I wrote.
Wow.
Because there was just too much happening and it didn't it there was so much more I could build into the characters, into the
Hmm.
story if I spread it out into
Hmm.
uh a standalone book. And so to me, I'm always going to see it like Dune,
Hmm.
which Dune is actually was released in serial as three books. It was like a trilogy.
Hmm.
But now when you see it in the story, you see it as one big book. So to me, this what's going
Hmm.
to be a trilogy is really always going to be one big book to me. But so
Right.
I'm basically
I
working
mean,
on
Lord of the
both.
Rings is the same way, right?
Yes, exactly.
Hmm.
And so it's going to be like that, but it's just like it's too long
Hmm.
for me to submit to like a publisher or an
Hmm.
agent like that. They're going to be like, I'm not publishing a 900-page novel as your debut.
Yeah.
So I did want to break it up so that it was smaller. But uh I think what's complicated about that is I need to kind of remember what plot threads are coming up to make sure
Mm.
that I build up to them. But
Hmm.
at the same time, I want this book to stand strong enough on its own because I don't want it to be like, well, I can't wait to just, I'll have to read the whole series to appreciate it. I want each book to feel like a full complete story. So if you only read the first book,
Hmm.
you would be like, that was a good story, or you were satisfied enough to put it down and never read another book again.
Hmm.
Because and it's not that I don't want you to read the series, but I want that book to be enough.
Hmm.
Because
That's such an
sometimes you read a series and you're like,
mhm.
I mean, it was all right, but I need to keep reading to find out what happens. But I want each book to feel like a full, complete book.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a really interesting take on series. So I loved reading series growing up. Like I never wanted to read a standalone book. But now as a writer, like I can't imagine writing a series, like basically everything I write is a standalone book. Um, but when I think back to my favorite series, they always have a satisfying conclusion to the problem taking place in that particular book.
Right.
But it's the difference, and we can talk about this in a different episode too when we talk more about craft. It's the difference between chronic tension and acute tension. And I talk to my students about this all the time about, your short story does not have to resolve the chronic tension happening to this character. The chronic tension is going to be everlasting. That's why it's chronic. You have to resolve the acute tension, though, which is what's powering the plot here.
Yeah.
And I think that, especially nowadays, people are so hooked on cliffhanger bullshit that they they might resolve a part of the acute tension, but then, ramp up the whole thing. Um, because that's how our publishing industry works now. It's how our film industry works now is, nobody wants a standalone IP anymore. They want to be able to
Hmm.
sell as much as possible. So I don't know. I find that kind of admirable that you as a writer want to give your readers something that's very, very satisfying. And obviously there will be threads that connect the other stories that continue the plot moving forward. But I think of one of my favorite sci-fi series, the Red Rising series by Pierce Brown. And the first book is very satisfying in itself. But then the first three books are like perfect, like chef's kiss. I love them. I have not read 4, 5, and 6 because 1, 2, and 3 were so satisfying.
Hmm.
And then 4, 5, and 6 take place 10 years later. And
Right.
I appreciate that as a reader, that he took the time to be like, this is a satisfying chunk, and there's more story if you want it, but this is also going to be very satisfying. So I love that that's your aim for your books is to be like, I obviously want you to continue reading, but
Right.
I don't want to leave you hungry, you know?
Right. Because I was thinking about hunger in particular. So there's
Hmm.
like books that are known for being like series books and stuff.
Hmm.
They kind of like make you feel like you're still hungry at the end of it, but not like, oh,
Hmm.
that was a good meal. I would love to eat that again. It's like you're like, I need something else,
Hmm.
like you're
Yeah.
not quite satisfied. So you
Hmm.
keep coming back hoping that the next book will satisfy you, but it never does because that's not the point of the book. The point of the book
Hmm.
is for you to buy more books.
Right.
And I don't want that because to
Hmm.
me, I'm not writing to make money because I
Hmm.
I know that I joke about that, but I'm really not. I'm
Well,
writing.
let's be real.
We're not
We know
gonna
we're not
make
going
money.
to,
Right.
right?
And so I've come to terms with that.
Hmm.
But what I want to do is I want to be someone who can write a satisfying story that makes you
Hmm.
like you reveal some truth about yourself or helps you
Hmm.
understand the world a little bit better.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so
I'm with you. I also, you know, I think one of the other things that's really difficult nowadays is it takes so long for the next book to come out,
Hmm.
or the author is incredibly rushed for the next book to come out. So it's almost a way of taking some pressure off of yourself as the writer, because we see things like Fourth Wing that takes, off in such a big way. And then the second book is like pushed out almost immediately because she had been working on it. But now the third book that everyone's clamoring for, there's a lot of pressure behind that. We see the same thing happening with Game of Thrones. These last books, it's been years writing
Or
these.
George.
Well, writing these sci-fi fantasy worlds takes time to do it well. Um, and you're putting pressure on the writer, you're putting pressure on the story. And when we have to meet those crazy deadlines, it's not going to be either what we want it to be, it's not going to be satisfying. I mean, I fully believe, hot take here, the Hunger Games series gets worse as it goes on, personally. However, Ballad of Songbird and Snake is an absolute incredible work of fiction. And I think it's because she was able to take the time to write the story she wanted to write. Whereas by the time the third Hunger Games came out, she was pressed up against a deadline, had to get that shit out because they were making movies, because there was this huge franchise behind it.
Hmm.
Um, so I don't know. I think it's really smart of you to do, not just for your readers, but also for yourself.
Yeah, and so I never read the Hunger Games series,
Hmm.
but from conversations I had with people that read it, my understanding of it was that perhaps she didn't have three books in her, but
Hmm.
she was required to write three books. And so
Exactly.
there was a lot of like stretching things out when like
Hmm.
she had enough content for maybe two solid books, she tried to
Hmm.
stretch it out into three books.
Right.
But I think that's a challenge that I'm undertaking here is I'm thinking about stuff like this that I've seen other writers do and other these pressures that they've had. So I'm
Hmm.
trying to take the time to write the book I want to write and have it on
Hmm.
solid footing because I have short stories that interconnect with this book. I have other stories that I've written that connect with this world because, like there's multiple planets and like the
Hmm.
political structures inform like this event happens over here, which informs
Hmm.
here. So I'm also trying to make sure that I'm thinking about all those future projects and how they relate so that when if I ever get to a point where I get to publish these stories that you can all read them, they all sound like they're all in conversation with one another. So that's another big part of my project. So when I'm writing this story about this princess and her quest that she goes on, I know that it's going to affect like the greater galaxy and all these other stories. So I have to keep that in mind too, that if she walks this way, that it's going to have a ripple effect on all these
Hmm.
other stories and projects I have planned.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that's one of the cool things that's happening nowadays as well is, prior to what we have modern, um, the closest that we get to something like that is the Silmarillion that has all these other side stories that Tolkien wrote to supplement the world of Middle Earth.
Yeah.
Whereas now you have like the ACOTAR series, there are novellas in between the books of side stuff that happened. Neil Shusterman wrote one of my favorite series, the Unwind series, which is a YA like dystopian,
Hmm.
and there is a novella that's released in between those as well. That's extra content because when you have these sci-fi fantasy writers, you guys have to build so much extra content into your world that it's nice if it can eventually be shared.
Yeah.
With me, I'm not writing a side story that takes place in Jacksonville, Um, if I were to write a sequel to any of my books, the second one would probably have a sequel because there are so many different points of view, and it could be about different characters and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But it's not building off of that same tension, that same plot line. It's exploring new things. Whereas your guys's medium is also interconnected, that you have to write all this extra content just to get to the main storyline.
Hmm. Yeah, might as well do something with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Which again, I think leads us down this rabbit hole of why writers have so many different projects going on at the same time. Because I think that's a really typical issue that a lot of writers have. And we've talked about like my weird self-discipline of I have an idea for my third book. I will not allow myself to start writing it until I finish the edits on this first one because I know that I will get stuck writing this third book and never finish my first one. Um, but I think that's a really common problem that we as writers have is that we
Hmm.
have so many different ideas and some of them connect and some of them don't, but we want to write down everything so that we don't lose it, which leads us to having six different projects at the same time and struggling to finish any one of them.
Yeah. Um, I think pretty much all of the projects I'm working on right now, I started when I was 20.
Wow.
Um, and they're all interconnected.
Hmm.
And they all take it like different. So anytime I change something in the story, it's gonna affect something in the story and then the story.
Hmm.
So I think that's why like
Hmm.
I want to complete this what I have so far of these worlds
Hmm.
before I let myself move on to other things. But I have other ideas of like significantly less convoluted, less interconnected stuff.
Hmm.
And then I refuse to let myself work on it. But it's just anytime I try and start working on these things, I feel so stuck because it's so massive. Because it's not just a
Hmm.
novel, it's not just a trilogy. It's like four different series and short
Hmm.
stories and stuff. So it just seems so monumental. But for me, I've noticed that if I let myself write and just write for fun, like things like any time I get an idea, I just let myself write that it helps me edit faster, helps me
Hmm.
get more edits done because it's not I'm reminding myself that I love to write and this is a joy to do. And so by letting myself have that freedom, I find myself more excited to sit down and edit because I kind of get those ideas out and it's not like I'm forcing myself to edit and being like, man, I wish I could work on a different project. So I do
Hmm.
let myself play because I think for me it helps expand my imagination and helps me to get out of this is a job mindset.
Yeah. Nice. I think that that leads really nicely into the question of like, what does our editing process look like, or how do we break these projects down into more manageable pieces? Because, as much as this podcast is about us kind of bitching to each other about it's hard being a writer. I also think we want to share what we've learned, what works for us, as people who have been writing for well over a decade, actively working towards these different goals and projects. So what works for you? What does your editing process look like when you start approaching this? I know you just said doing some free writes helps you get through edits, but like, what does that look like?
So I would say free writes aside, free writes are just it's basically just to warm me up and get me
Hmm.
into the world of writing again and get excited about writing. Um, so for me, when I edit, I typically handwrite my edits. So I
Hmm.
print them out, or I have a Kindle Scribe. So sometimes I'll send it to my Kindle Scribe, which is basically it's like you can write on it. So I
Hmm.
send a PDF to it and I write on it just like I would on a piece of paper. And then I send that PDF back to my computer and then I open up my project and I add my like quick edits. I'll just go in and I'll do stuff that's like,
Hmm.
oh, this needs to change. But like big story stuff, I'll put like little comments like, hey, this is not working. And
Hmm.
then I'll go back in my computer and start to reread and go through those comments bit by bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I also like to edit by hand, print stuff out. Which, I always feel bad because I'm wasting so much paper. Your Kindle Scribe is awesome. I've wanted to steal it from you for a while. So I love that you're able to do that. But
Mhm.
I agree. My editing process is similar where I write the first draft on the computer and then print everything out, read through it, do edits by hand, and then have to retype those edits into the computer. And I think going through that process gives me almost two chances to edit
Yeah.
because I'll add extra stuff as I'm putting it back into the computer. Um, I also am a huge, huge, huge believer in reading stuff out loud, which like I hate doing sometimes, but it helps my editing process so much because it
Yeah.
forces my brain to slow down. Because at this point, I'm so familiar with my novel that like I'll glance through it and be like, oh, I know what happens here, and forget like I am supposed to be editing. I have to read each word carefully. I have to consider each word carefully. And reading out loud helps me do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I save that. That's kind of a like a more final step,
Hmm.
just because I don't want to like get the words perfect and then be like, oh, I'm
Uh-huh.
gonna have to redo this entire plot line. So it has to
Yeah.
be more at a solid place. But there's definitely parts of my novel that I'm like, this is ready for a verbal read through because it's
Hmm.
everything I want is there. It's solid. I just need to kind of figure out the rhythm of how I
Hmm.
want this to sound.
Yeah. That's smart of you because I will read through it out loud and then end up where I am now, completely rewriting a plot line. So, it can be very, very, as we've said, frustrating at times because, no first draft is good enough. It just isn't. First drafts are not meant to see the light of day necessarily.
Right.
I was on my third full draft by the time I sent it out to beta readers, to get feedback. Um, it's a long process. Now, the funny thing is, my second novel, I cranked out the first draft, did my own edits, and then sent out the second draft to beta readers and felt much more confident about it. So, I think different projects are going to have different timelines as we continue to get more experienced.
Absolutely. I definitely think that. And in fact, hoping for that after I finish this book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
But have you sent is this the book that you sent out to beta readers? Have you sent out sections of it to beta readers, or what's that look like for you?
so I really wanted to wait until I finished draft two to send it out to beta readers,
Hmm.
but I was having so much trouble making forward motion on this. I think mostly a lot of it had to do with some challenges with like my mental health
Hmm.
and just not being able to focus. So I really needed a deadline. I
Yeah.
needed to have I needed, I'm a people pleaser. So having this expectation that people are waiting for the next part
Hmm.
to motivate me to finish it. So I sent the prologue and part one, which is about the first third of the book and a
Hmm.
bit. So I'm going to be sending the second third of the book soon. I'm
Hmm.
hoping that I can do it within the next 2 weeks, and then
Hmm.
I have no idea how long the third part is going to take. I think it'll take faster. I think it'll be faster because middles are my
Hmm.
weak point.
Middles are
Uh,
hard.
Middles are hard. So I think once I get through part two, I think because part one went like that for
Hmm.
edits, but part two has just been it's a slog.
Hmm.
Um, and I think part three will go a little faster because it's exciting. It's,
Hmm.
the climax and the
Yeah.
resolution and building into the next book. So
Hmm.
I just need to get through part two.
Hmm. But I really like that. I think that, that's the thing is that what works for one writer isn't necessarily going to work for everybody. So I think that that's really smart of you to be able to recognize, like, yeah, I would like to get through a solid draft to give my beta readers the completion, but that's not how my brain's going to work, and that's not what's going to be successful for me.
Right.
Um, so I think that that is really nice that you were able to recognize that and find a system that works for you.
Right.
Um,
I would also
you
like to
know.
point out
Mm,
that two things. One, I know my beta readers. They're personal friends of mine.
mm-hmm,
And so I have a relationship with them and
mm-hmm,
they understand me and they know me.
mm-hmm.
Two, I set up the expectation like, look, this is not a full book. This is only the
Yes.
first part, and I will be sending you the parts in junk.
Mm-hmm,
So before they even agreed to what
mm-hmm.
they were doing, I let them know that this was what it was going to be. So I think if you're going to do something like that, just make sure your beta readers understand that they're not getting the full book.
Yeah, definitely,
That'd be
definitely.
kind of dickish to be like, oh yeah, it's only the first third.
Yeah, no, very good piece of advice. And I think that that kind of goes into, and again, we've talked about this in a couple different episodes and we'll revisit eventually, but when picking your beta readers, having very, very clear expectations of what you're looking for. Because when I sent out my first round of beta readers, my first novel, I was really disappointed with what I got back. I didn't pick the people as carefully as I should have. I picked people who are friends who I knew like to read. Um, so I didn't get back the edits, the feedback that I was really looking for. It was a lot of like, oh, I really like this. And it's like, well, that's wonderful. I'm glad, but I need something to help me improve. Um,
Hmm.
so I picked my second round of beta readers a lot more carefully and was much more clear with what feedback I was looking for. Which ties into last episode, we talked about workshops of having those like preset questions. I know this needs help. This is where I'm looking for that help. So I think that the editing process is a collaborative effort to some degree.
Yes, I definitely think so. Especially thinking about future editing, which would take
Hmm.
place between hopefully your agent and you, and
Hmm.
then eventually your publisher. And there's going to be so much more editing that's going to go into the process there. So I also try to remind myself of that too. Like, it doesn't
Hmm.
have to be perfect, but it has to be representative of the book that you want to present to the world because
Yeah.
ultimately it's going to see a lot of edits,
Hmm.
hopefully, before are ever so lucky to see its publication. Um, but I
Yeah.
think going through beta reading kind of helps you get ready for this monumental labor of love getting picked apart.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing, like, so we'll talk about this when we talk about querying agents, but the advice that we get time and time and time again from every agent discussion we have been to, every article that we've read is do not query an agent until your draft is as close to ready to publish as possible, which is very, very true. I mean, that's why my book has been through so many different versions, is because there's constantly stuff that I know I want to change, that I know I want to fix. Before it gets to the publishing phase. The thing that becomes frustrating is we're going to get this as close to ready to publish as possible. And then our agent is going to have notes, our publisher is going to have notes, our editor is going to have notes, and it's going to go through an entire new draft. And hopefully, if you're lucky, they're not going to change that much. It'll be minor things. But it's really, really
Unlikely.
important. You're right, yeah. But it's really important for us to do that legwork as writers on our own, to get it as close to ready to publish as possible. And I also think that that forces us to become more familiar with our work so that we're able to advocate for it. So that when these powerhouse publishers come to you and say, well, we really want to end this on a cliffhanger because that's what we're going to do to sell the next book. You're going to be able to say, no, I've spent 10 years working on this, and this is why it's ending this way. And the same thing for my book of like, you know, one of my main characters plays D&D, and like D&D might not sell super well. It's definitely having a resurgence, obviously, but like some of my beta readers were like, I don't know what a nat 20 is. I don't understand what neutral good is. I don't. So for me
I'm
to be
not your
able to,
audience. That's just how I feel.
right, exactly. So for me to be able to argue and say, like, no, these phrases are important. I love the D20 on the shelf. Um, these phrases are important to the culture that this character is a part of. Going through this editing process gives us a better chance to advocate on behalf of our story.
Yeah, and I think the more you work in your story, the better you know it, the
Hmm.
better you're able to advocate for it and like explain your choices. And I think too, again, I haven't been fortunate enough to have this conversation like with an agent or anything, but I do feel like if your agent was like, I just don't this isn't working. And if you're
Hmm.
able to explain, like, oh, the reason I have it this way is this, blah, blah, blah. I
Hmm.
think that maybe then you could have the conversation where they're like, okay, but that's not what's coming across. Let's talk about how we could make that more
Exactly.
obvious.
Yeah. And that goes back to our discussion about workshops is it's all about have helping the author's purpose shine through clearer,
Yes.
not about changing what the author is trying to accomplish. And if you find a good agent, I mean, your agent's job is to advocate for you and for your book.
Right.
Um,
So
so,
they should
if
get you.
right. So if you're able to clearly explain what you're going for, your agent is going to help you get there. And then they're also going to be able to help advocate because you want an agent who loves your book, who thinks this is one of the greatest books ever written. You want somebody who's going to be on your side when the publishers come to you and try to change things. Not to say that publishers are, always going to try to change everything, but that is again, from all the discussions that we've ever heard, a big part of it. Um,
Hmm.
so, doing this legwork, as frustrating as it is to go through draft after draft after draft and beta readers and, revisions and changing major plot points and checking continuity and all the rest of it, it's
Yeah.
such an important step to do if you want to be published, and
Yeah.
especially published traditionally.
Yes. I do want to say that I am very excited for if again, if I'm ever so lucky to get an agent,
Hmm.
I'm very excited for the process of having someone else to help me edit my
Hmm.
novel to be the novel I want it to be because sometimes I get a little lost. I'm like, I know what I want this novel to be, but I don't know what's missing and what I need
Hmm.
to edit. So being able to have somebody who believes in the story, who understands writing and editing, who can
Hmm.
like really get in there and help me write the book that I want to write and
Hmm.
help me make that extra little leap. I'm excited for that.
Yeah.
I'm really
Yeah.
excited. I hope it happens.
Yeah. Well, and I do want to take just a small side street here and talk about, you and I both have the ambition of publishing traditionally.
Yes.
Um, but these steps of working on the current projects and seeing them all the way through is almost twice as important for those of you who want to self-publish, because self-publishing does have the reputation to some degree of, oh, this person wrote a first draft and published on Amazon. Um, and obviously, that is not true for a lot of, self-published authors. There are a lot of self-published authors who, get their books out there, they get picked up by traditional publishing. Um, but going through the editing process, I think is almost twice as important when taking a self-publishing route.
Hmm.
Whereas, like you said, for us hoping to do the traditional publishing route, we're going to have editors and agents to fall back on to help us get through that process.
Right. And also there's more people that can prevent something small
Hmm.
from sneaking out. I think I really applaud indie authors who are able
Hmm.
to self-publish because that's a lot of, to put on to yourself.
Yeah.
Because you're responsible for all of that. And I think
Yep.
that's really amazing that people are able to do that. But you're
Hmm.
right, there is a bad rap for
Yeah.
self-published authors because there are some bad self-published stuff out there, but there's some really phenomenal,
Hmm.
great writing that gets not as much recognition because of people who just wanted to put something on Amazon.
Yeah. I mean, the working in a bookstore, I see both sides of the self-publishing industry, with the people who come in who are like, yeah, I've always wanted to write a book and I finally retired. And so I wrote this down about my life, and it's bad. It's really, really bad.
Yeah.
And I've seen the flip side of that, of people who are like, yeah, I've been thinking about this book for 20 plus years, and I finally have the time in my life to sit down and write it. And they took the time to go to creative writing classes, to get an editing process, and it's great. But it is it's just a lot more difficult for those self-published authors to get the credibility.
Yeah.
And again, we'll talk about the difference between self-publishing and indie publishing with small presses, and going through the big publisher traditional, all that kind of stuff. But my biggest point in bringing all of this up is all of us have to go through this editing process as efficiently as we can. And when we have six different projects all needing this type of attention, um, it can be really difficult to focus, which is why we have these projects that have lasted 10 years before they're ready to see the light of day. It's very, very common. And I don't want people to get discouraged because it's taking them a little bit longer to get the project to someplace that they're proud of.
Yeah. That's okay. Like it takes time and
Hmm.
you're not late.
Yeah.
Just you go at your own pace. There's no
Hmm.
rush to get it out there.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll get there eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Uh,
is there anything else you want to talk about with editing or our current projects or anything like that?
Not that I can think of.
Okay. I think I have one other thing I want to touch
Okay.
on. Um, just talking about, current projects. One of the other things that authors these days are facing is finding an audience. And when trying to be published traditionally, there is this idea that you have to have a built-in following already. So I know
Mm,
that you and I have both made a lot of progress on social media trying to build that up. And so, like, I write a blog about writing every other week. And when focusing on these like mini projects almost, because the blogs are not long, um, that is time that I'm writing that's taken away from my major projects. And so I think it's hard because it's not just the projects that we want to be working on that are distracting us, it's the projects that we have to get done that can be distracting for our writing process as well. And I think that's become increasingly frustrating for authors these days of, you and I are both spending so much time trying to get published for short stories. And I know, at least for me personally, that's not even what I want to do, but I want to have a publishing credit for when I go to agents and go to publishing houses that I have something to my name. So it's really, it's not like it used to be where you can just focus solely on this one novel and then try to get published. There are other projects that you're forced to do in order to try and get this novel published.
yeah, I mean, I do think that part of that pressure is perhaps a little artificial.
Hmm.
Like we've been told from the
Hmm.
classes we went to that this is all important. But I would strongly advise if you're working on a very specific project and you know books that are similar, I would go ahead and do a cursory look at the publication history of this person that you admire whose work is similar
Hmm.
to yours,
Hmm.
because that kind of helped put a little less pressure on me because I've these books that I really like, these space opera books that are kind of similar to mine, like feminist space operas, a lot of them were never published before. Like this was their only project, and they didn't start social media until after they got the book deal. So that
Hmm.
kind of opened my eyes that maybe I don't need to be putting this pressure on myself right now, and
Hmm.
that maybe I don't need to scatter my attention, and maybe I could just focus on that. I'm not saying that I'm doing that because I'm not, but
Yeah.
it did kind of remind me that like there's different paths and that I don't have to have this accepted path that I need to have publishing credit, I need to have a social media platform, that these are things that can come in due time. And you kind of have to make those decisions of what makes sense to you. And protect your peace is something that I always say. So
Hmm.
if like for me, I did do TikTok for a while, and I'm not saying I don't do it anymore, but I haven't been posting as regularly because it was very I got too focused in that and like
Hmm.
my view counts and how many followers I had, that I would get like it would kind of be like it would break my concentration because I'd be like, well, I how can I write this book if like I can't even get people
Hmm.
to follow me on TikTok? And it's like because that's not your medium. Your medium
Hmm.
isn't making videos. Your medium is writing stories, which you're not doing because you're upset that your videos aren't taking off. So I think you have to find the path that aligns with you, and I think there's so many different paths that you can take.
I love that. I think that that's kind of something that I also needed to hear right now, because as I get ready to go into maternity leave, I'm, constantly thinking about my blog, and I'm like, oh, well, I need to write this many extra pieces so that I can, space them out, and blah, blah, blah. And like, you're gonna write some for me, and like trying to do this very, like, in the grand scheme of things, very arbitrary project that's adding extra stress for very little reason. It's not like I have a solid following. I enjoy doing my blog because as a teacher, I enjoy breaking down the mechanics of writing. But like, I think I also needed to hear that the protect your peace, like focus on the big picture, focus on the thing that's most important. And for me personally, right now, what's most important is getting through these last 70 pages of edits before I have a baby, because then that's going to be the most important thing for a while,
Yeah.
you know? Um, and, life catches up with us in a lot of different ways. So Yeah, I appreciate that. I think I need to hear that.
Good. I just because I just think like the more you spread yourself,
Hmm.
the less you're giving to each thing.
Yeah, definitely.
So you got to think about where you want to put your energy because you have a limited amount of energy you can put into things. And like there's some energy that's allotted for your family
Hmm.
and there's some energy that's allotted for XYZ. But
Yeah.
you need, but when you have that last little bit of energy and you're like, I'm a splash a little over here, a little over here, a little in my novel,
Hmm.
you're not really making much progress
Yeah,
and
definitely.
anything. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I appreciate that.
Okay. And also, like, you can always do these things later. Like, maybe
Right.
you
Yeah.
focus on this now, and then you're like, I really want to get my blog, but I
Yeah.
think you gotta check yourself, check in with yourself. Like,
Hmm.
what can I do that would be the most satisfying?
Yep. Absolutely. I'm Abigail,
And I'm Maddie, and this has been
two writers.
Many Wrongs.